today, I think that there is a need for a similar kind of coalition, a coalition that has to do with a woman's right to choose. Coalition has to do with voting rights, civil rights, and religious freedom. Today, we're going to have to develop that coalition of people who are struggling for freedom and against tyranny. And we're going to have to do that again for democracy.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to Frank Schaeffer with my guest today. This is a podcast called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It goes live on Facebook first, then to YouTube, and then to all the other channels we're on, including most places that podcasts appear, Substack, and all the rest of that. So with no further ado, I just want to jump right in and introduce the guests that we have today. Norman Hill and Velma Murphy Hill are authors of a book that I'm holding up here. And if you can see this, it's dog-eared. I just want to show you. I have lots of pages turned down, notes all through it, passages I want to quote.
Very good.
Yeah. And I've read it and I love this book. We'll be talking about it in depth. Climbing the Rough Side of the Mountain, the Extraordinary Journey of Love, Civil Rights, and Labor Activism. It was published October 17, so this is a new book. Before I get going, I want to thank my agent, Jennifer Lyons, who has been handling my literary output for the last 20 years, and she is also the agent for these authors, Norma Hill and Velma Murphy Hill. She told me a long time ago, I'm handling an amazing book. You're going to want to read it. And then later she got to me and said, why don't you do this book as a podcast? And I was already so interested in the project that, of course, I jumped at the chance. So first of all, thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Norman and Velma, for being here with me today. It's a real honor. Having read the book, I can say it's a real honor as well as a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So let me jump in. I've got so many quotes here, but I want to start pretty far into the book with something that jumped out just on a personal note that I thought was a lovely way to begin the whole discussion here. It's actually way into the book on page 222. But as Norman's troubles worsened, and we're going to talk about the problems you had with your eyesight, and this is you writing, Velma, I just couldn't do that anymore. You have to understand that Norman and I, besides being husband and wife, are friends.
Yes.
We really are friends. We really care about each other. There were times when I would look at him and see the darkness closing in on him. I would just hold him. And I wanted to start with that because I think that when you read a book that is about a 60-year journey through the civil rights movement and the labor movement, and I want to really get into that because that's an amazing subject to talk about. You think of civil rights as one thing and the labor movement as another, and you've completely changed the way I see that history now because of your book. Before we get there, I just want to say that it's such a wonderful love story. And as someone who's been married himself for the last 53 years to Jeannie, with lots of ups and downs, the first thing that touched me about your book was the love story. I just love your love story, if I can put it that way. And then we'll get to the politics and the labor movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of other stuff. But the first thing I want to say is, unexpectedly, Climbing the Rough Side of the Mountain is a wonderful love story. And it was my pleasure and honor to get a little glimpse into your lives, just that part. So let's talk about that first. How you met a little bit, which of course I read in the book, and this incredible arch of a personal story that the book follows in a beautiful narrative, and you're both such good writers. Last thing I'm going to say, and then I promise you I'm going to be talking very little for the rest of this and asking you questions. I thought that you came up with a terrific device for letting us know whose voice was speaking. in the italicized passages where all of a sudden, you're reading Norman, and then you're reading Velma, and it was effortless. And I just thought you did a terrific thing together. And really, it's an amazing book, but just being able to co-author a book together so seamlessly, I just thought was terrific. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and ask you about your lives together. This great story that I've just read, it goes back a long way. Introduce yourselves to people who haven't read the book. And again, here it is. And I'm going to be thumbing through this and showing you all some of the pictures in the book as well. There's a terrific photo section. We'll get to that in a minute. So I don't know which of you want to start, but Norman or Velma, could you just introduce yourselves in terms of when you met, what year it was, and all the rest of it?
I am Norman Hill, and Velma Murphy Hill and I met in 1960 on a picket line in Chicago. We were picketing in support of the Southern students who were sitting in at Woolworth's store. And we were in front of the Chicago Woolworths supporting their efforts to desegregate Woolworths. We were introduced by my younger brother, who said to Velma, "You ought to meet my brother. He talks strange or odd like you, and maybe a socialist." So Velma introduced me, and Brother John introduced Velma to me, and we talked, and Velma invited me to dinner. And that was the beginning of a relationship that would go on for 63 years of marriage and an extraordinary story of life, love, civil rights, and labor activism.
Mm.
By the way, my mom cooked. I didn't cook.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump to one thing here you have in the acknowledgments, just to let people know, because you guys are so humble in your presentation of yourselves in the book. I just want you all to understand something, that talking to Norman and Velma is a big deal. Let me tell you who has endorsed this book. I'll just run through some names, and then we were going to get into the book. You have to understand, this is not just an ordinary book. Charlene Hunter Galt, the reporter, Reverend Al Sharpton, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congressman Robert C. Bobby Scott, Abraham Foxman, Mark Morial, Carl Gershman, Cleola Brown, Liz Schuler, Lee Saunders, Richard L. Trumka, Mary Kay Henry, and William Julius Wilson. And when you look through the book, you're going to meet Martin Luther King Jr., who Norman and Velma worked with, and a lot of other folks. So I don't want to do any name dropping, but I just want people who are listening to this podcast to understand that these people we're talking to have not just participated in the making of the history of our country, they have witnessed it. And part of what I want to talk about today with Norman and Velma is just the arc of that witnessing. Cutting toward the end of the book, Velma, you have a passage at the end saying that there's things that give you pause and sorrow now, and that sometimes Norman is still more positive about the direction of our country, and sometimes you feel rather depressed by the way things are going. I know that's toward the end of the book, but let me just start there, because I want to probe your wisdom in terms of the direction of this country. And you talk about the Trump years, and of course, you had experience as labor organizers, even in Israel. You have a breadth of knowledge of the planet. You have traveled so much. You've organized the labor movement across the globe. There's so much here, I hardly know where to start. But let's just start with you, Velma, and this kind of, I won't say pessimistic view, but that there's enough going on now that is a bit of a disappointment in looking back over that arc in terms of, well, how much did we really manage to do, given that, I mean, the best example is we had our first Black president, and 2 minutes later, we're looking at Donald Trump, two steps forward, 1 or 2 steps back.
Yeah.
Let me get out of the way and just let you talk about what you see as the state of the nation right now.
First of all, let me thank you for having us on and for listening to us. Norman and I think we were soldiers in an army. And when we first met, we integrated Rainbow Beach. And because I was struck on the head with 17 stitches, the community came out to support us. And a coalition of forces, labor unions, community groups, religious groups, and civil rights groups came out and supported us. And, today, I think that there is a need for a similar kind of coalition, a coalition that has to do with a woman's right to choose. Coalition has to do with voting rights, civil rights, and religious freedom. And that occurred to us when we saw the emergence of I don't know, that guy.
Yeah, that guy.
That guy, the emergence of that guy and who supported him. And it's really interesting because in the, I guess, 60s, 70s, we struggled to defeat
Klansman David Duke.
Yeah. And prevent him from being governor. And, it seems like today
that was 1991.
Yeah. Okay. Today, we're going to have to develop that coalition of people who are struggling for freedom and against tyranny. And we're going to have to do that again for democracy. And I think that Norman and I understand that our country has problems, but we are the leaders in democracy around the world. And we have to be in favor of democracy for workers, for Blacks, for Hispanics, for all kinds of minorities. We have to be in favor of developing coalitions. And somehow it's like history repeating itself, unfortunately. And there is a poem which I love because it says what I feel, and that is freedom doesn't come like a bird on the wing, doesn't come down like the summer's rain. You got to fight for it. You got to struggle for it, day and night for it. And every generation has to win it again. So pass it on. And we have to pass it on. And I think that Norman and I and our love together will pass it on to whomever will listen.
Speaking of being struck in the head with the rock, one of the touching passages in the book, and since it's in the book, I don't feel like I'm being too personal because you wrote it down.
Yeah.
Is the fact that blow in the head thrown by someone who was a racist, who didn't want you to integrate that beach.
Yes.
And that injury led to a serious medical problem where you then, in the end, because of that, one thing led to another, and you lost a child, you lost a pregnancy.
That's correct.
And we're not able after that to have more children, I don't think.
That's
and
correct.
in the book, you know, so speaking of dues paying, I just want to tell people who are listening to this, if you read the book, the dues were paid again and again by both Norman and Velma, but Velma in the most direct sense, that injury almost killed you finally in terms of the complication that put you in a hospital.
Yes.
You lost a child.
Yeah. I was paralyzed for like 6-7 months.
Yeah. And I just point that out on the way by. Let me jump into something that I really want to get into because it's so unique to your book. In fact, I read quite a bit. Forgive my ignorance, but I have not encountered this anywhere before, and I mentioned it before, and that is this correlation between the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And what amazed me is, I just want to read something from page 244. Norman and I have worked with labor activists and leaders in such nations as, and this list is amazing, Israel, France, Germany, Switzerland, Canada, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Lesotho, Tunisia, Brazil, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. During our work in the US, we met with many international defenders of liberty and democracy. Among them was Lech Wałęsa, leader of Poland's anti-Soviet trade union Solidarity, and eventually president of a free Poland. Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he gave us one of his autographed books. And I will never forget meeting Senegal's president and resident poet scholar Leopold Senghor in the country's sea-splashed capital of Dakar during one of my many trips to Africa. I think this is in your voice, isn't it?
Yes.
This is you writing, isn't it, Velma?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, in the country's sea-splashed capital of Dakar during one of my many trips to Africa. He had just flown in from France, where he spent most summers. It was one of the most exciting times of my life. And then I'm going to just continue here a little bit because into, I believe, Norman's voice here, the one thing that links all the international involvement, work, and exposure that Velma and I have had is the furtherance of democracy. If you are training trade unionists who will be free and independent, then that work is part of building a free and independent society. If a country has a free and independent labor movement, then it has a solid democratic institution. And I just love the way you work those themes together. And I'm stunned by the fact that professionally, both careers you got paid for plus activism you weren't paid for, follow these twin paths. So go there. I mean, you know, it's like meeting an oncologist who also happened to be, you know, a world's great chef. You don't see these things usually together. Trade union activism combined with, you know, you don't think of these as one and the same. And I just love the way you tie it together in your book. So talk about that symbiotic relationship in your own lives and how you see the issues of trade unions and all the rest of it.
You want to take that, Norma?
Well, a prime example from our own experience of labor and civil rights activism was what occurred when I went to Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 as a leader of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, an organization made up primarily of Black trade unionists, welcoming anyone sharing its commitment to racial equality and economic justice, acting as a bridge between the trade union movement and the civil rights movement, between organized labor and the Black community. I went to Memphis to work with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Union staff and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to organize community support for striking sanitation workers. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Memphis to lend his prestige and leadership to the campaign. I helped organize a march in support of the striking sanitation workers to City Hall in Memphis, led by Martin Luther King Jr. Youth participants in the march broke ranks and threw stones and rocks at store windows and began to loot. The police responded by tear gassing the march, and Martin Luther King Jr. turned the march back to its point of origin. Depressed by the fact that for the first time, a march under his leadership experienced a breakdown in discipline, I joined the staff in persuading Martin Luther King Jr. that he ought to lead a second march, indicating that this was a trade union struggle and that we would recruit union leaders and increase the labor presence to help maintain discipline. Martin Luther King began leading the organization of the Second March when he was assassinated.
Yes.
Mm.
We continued to organize the march despite the shocking experience of King's assassination. The march took place as a memorial to Dr. King and in support of striking sanitation workers who eventually gained union recognition and negotiated a collective bargaining agreement, bettering their wages, hours, and working conditions. But that's just one example of the intertwining of labor and civil rights in struggle that we were directly involved in.
Mm. The question I have for you is that it seems to me that one of the problems the Democratic Party faces these days is that a lot of the identity politics has gotten in the way of what you were talking about earlier in terms of being understood as both a civil rights movement, politically and socially, and a labor movement and a union movement. You had a long history with the AFL-CIO and the formation of various attachments to unions. Talk a little more about that, but also just get into this sort of slide away from being identified with American workers as part of a civil rights struggle representing all races and backgrounds. And I just think that both of your vision of this and the way you lived it out in your work is very unique, but it's also very instructive for the moment. You were talking about history repeating itself. We kind of need you back again, leading us back into, or opening doors in people's minds back into this idea that civil rights and all human rights go hand in hand with labor rights and union rights. And it's not something you hear talked about very much these days. And I really want to just keep going there because I think you've got an absolutely unique voice in this that comes through in this book. By the way, let me just reintroduce it. You're listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We are talking with the authors of Climbing the Rough Side of the Mountain, The Extraordinary Story of Love, Civil Rights, and Labor Activism by Norman Hill and Velma Murphy Hill. Here's the book. Fabulous photo section all the way through, lots of pictures of the civil rights movement, but also the labor movement we're talking about. So just get back to this question. What has happened to the progressive movement now that just seems so different than hands-on, get down in the trenches, build a labor movement, fight for civil rights as all one big battle? That's not how people think of progressives these days.
I do believe that we have an educational job to do. And I think that many people don't really understand the labor movement. The labor movement today, for instance, is the most democratic institution in our country. And we don't talk about it enough, and it's not talked about enough. It's more integrated than business. Every Sunday morning most people go to segregated churches. The school system is not quite integrated. and even though we've tried to integrate it, but the labor movement is the most integrated institution in this country. And the labor movement has begun to be activated. All over the city, for instance, teachers are going on strike. Actors are going on strike. They are saying to this country, we want to be heard. We want to be respected. We want to have decent wages. And I think we don't talk about it enough. And I'm not sure what's happening in our educational institutions, because I haven't been involved as much as I should be. But we have to be our own ambassadors.
Mm.
And we are not quite there yet. Now, the civil rights movement is going through changes, and I think it doesn't have the leadership that it had before. And I think that it is developing new important leadership. And I think that it does have at base coalition politics. The NAACP, for instance, began to understand early that economic rights were very important. And now they incorporated the economy and justice for workers in their push toward freedom.
Mm.
But I think that we do have a long way to go. And unfortunately, this year, next year, and the following year, I think that we have to get on the ball and understand that coalition politics is very important and very needed.
Yeah, in the book, Norman, you and Velma both talk a lot about this word coalition. That's another thing that jumped out at me. I think two things of your book, lots jumps out. It's a great book, but two things that were unexpected in the book was the emphasis you place on building coalitions, early coalitions with the labor movement that were first incorporating African American and Black voices, and then all sorts of other coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
And you emphasize this all the way through, and in the epilogue of the book, or toward the end, you re-emphasize the need for coalitions. Norman or Velma, whoever wants to go there, can you just talk a little more about why we need coalitions, what a coalition is, why we can't all live in our separate little bubbles?
Yes.
But we have to come together and work on things. And one other question, what sort of issues are big enough to drive us together to form a coalition, whether it's white and Black or Christian and atheist or older and younger? There've got to be things that are important enough where we can build a coalition around it. Maybe you could name a few of those, but also just tell us about your own coalition building and why we need to do it again.
Well, coalition is the organization of a group and group or groups based on common self-interest, in which the emphasis is on that which the groups have in common, and to act on that. We see that there is a organization called the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights,
Mm-hmm.
which is the major chief lobbying arm of the civil and human rights movement that presses and watchdogs Congress and the president on civil and human rights issues to make sure that existing legislation is enforced and where need be strengthened and further built. It's a coalition that operates on consensus. For example, there is a need for voting rights legislation to counter efforts at voter suppression, where the qualifications for voting are made more stringent, are made more difficult, in fact, to restrict voter participation. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and it's a coalition of civil rights, trade union, religious organizations, women's groups, pressed during the early years of the Biden administration for voting rights legislation, which was thwarted by a filibuster in the United States Senate. But that's still very much a part of the agenda. That's an issue, that's a basic issue in terms of making registration to vote as easy as possible, so that there is the great involvement, and in fact, moving toward a majoritarian strategy in the pursuit of racial equality and economic justice.
And the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was created by A. Philip Randolph, one of our mentors, and Bayard Rustin, one of our mentors. And coalition politics lives today and is the result of it was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965.
The Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act, yes. And it's very interesting. Maya Wiley is the daughter of George Wiley, who was a civil rights activist, and I think he drowned in earlier years. But he was a civil rights activist, and I think it is being passed on quietly, but firmly.
She heads the Leadership Conference today.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to just mention in passing was, Norman, I think I referred to this in that little passage I wrote about how you see each other as friends, which seems obvious, but not all married couples are, and that friendship is extraordinary. But part of that was honed through the loss of your sight and this weird series of cataract operations that seemed to go wrong, and then later you found out it was a genetic thing that goes back into, I guess, you get from your parents or your mother. It's pretty rare condition. How, just on a personal note, how has that unfolded? When did that happen? I know the dates, but I don't want to thumb through the book. When did you become have all this problem with sight and being impaired? What were those years?
In 2004,
yeah,
I went to the doctor to have cataracts removed. And as the cataracts were removed, I lost sight. The doctor re-examined me and said that the the removal of the cataracts was flawless, and at first couldn't really figure out why I lost sight until I went to a specialist who said that I was the victim of a disease passed on from the mother to the son with the fancy title of Labor's optical hereditary neuropathy, affecting the specific nerve. And I remember feeling, when I lost this sight, feeling at a loss, somewhat depressed, because as an activist, I had taken for granted having sight and seeing, reading, speaking.
He always read a lot.
And it was Velma who provided support and friend and encouraged me to find a way to keep on keeping on with the keeping on. And I began having my assistant, with whom I worked as I projected ideas. When I spoke, I gave speeches, and the speeches were typed in large print so that I could, in fact, read them and project, effectively speaking. And so that I found a way to keep on speaking and addressing key audiences, unions, civil rights, and community organizations as a part of my ongoing work. I think that today I found a way to continue to be mobile. I don't travel as much as I did, but when I do travel, I am able to get assistance in checking in at an airport, boarding a plane, and being met at the airport destination when the plane lands, and escorted to the meeting or convention or speaking engagement to which I'm going, so that I find today that I'm able to function pretty well, even with the loss of sight.
And by the way, the title of the book is based on Norman's experiences, and my saying to him after he got, I think, 5 minutes of applause after an A. Philip Randolph meeting, my saying to him, well, his friend said to him, "Boy, that was wonderful. How did you do it? How did you remember?" And I said to him and to the friend, we are climbing the rough side of a mountain. And in the words of an old Negro spiritual, You got to keep climbing in order to be a success. And our success is based on our principles and our knowledge and our mentors, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. And we will continue to climb the rough side of the mountain because we do have ladders. The rough side of the mountain is not smooth. And the smooth side, you'll fall off. And the rough side, you can hold on.
And for us, the rough side is composed of the operating principles that we have inherited from the legacy of our mentors, A. Philip Randolph, who was the nation's greatest Black labor leader, and Bayard Rustin is the most outstanding colleague, a civil rights leader in his own right, arrested over 20 times. Those operating principles are, we are committed to a society in which racial equality and economic justice will prevail, believing that Blacks can make the most progress by simultaneously confronting the barriers of race and class, that in the pursuit of racial equality and economic justice, we adopt a majoritarian strategy involving coalition politics. For us, we think that Blacks ought to aggressively and militantly pursue racial equality and economic justice. But being a numerical and racial minority, they ought to do so in such a way as to maximize friends and minimize enemies, to generate majority support. And as we referred to before, for us, the core, the essence of the coalition is an alliance between the trade union movement and the civil rights movement, an organized labor and Black community. Comparatively speaking, Randolph in his day said that there were pitifully few Black millionaires, not very many more Blacks who owned or ran and managed large businesses or corporations. Blacks, if they were employed, or employed as workers, and being the most historically exploited of workers, they had a direct economic bread and butter interest in participating at all levels in that movement that's about improving the lives of working people, namely the trade union movement. The other operating principles that we follow and are essential to our activism are the commitment to liberation. By that, self-liberation. By that we mean any group that is mistreated or oppressed or discriminated against should take the initiative to challenge the unfair and unjust status quo in which they find themselves. We believe a commitment to mass action, the march, the picket line, the boycott, some means by which those who have the problem, along with their allies, can confront key decision makers in pressing for change, and a commitment to nonviolence. By that we do not mean passive non-resistance, but the use of nonviolence is an integral part of direct mass action. So those operating principles are the means that we use to climb the mountain in our continuing struggle for racial equality and economic justice.
And you mentioned, you asked us to mention those things that can bring coalitions together now. Voting rights are very, very important to Blacks, Hispanics, all groups. A woman's right to choose is very important to not just women, but the men who love them and who care about them. And I think that is very, very important, and will be significant in the coming years.
Your sentence back there, maximize friends and minimize enemies.
Yes.
My producer Ernie just sent me a little text saying, is the mantra for 2024.
Aha.
That's what we've got to do. Maximize friends and minimize enemies. There's a quote in your book that I like, that I just want you to explore a little bit. Let's see who's writing. I think in this instance, it's Norman's voice. I don't think young people in America today have that feeling about being part of a movement with clear objectives that makes a transition from protest to political action. And that's too bad. When we were marching and organizing and teaching, all kinds of people, black and white, were involved. We and they were part of a movement that passed groundbreaking, comprehensive civil rights legislation. We don't see much of that now. And I think that's a real challenge to all of us. But I just want you to expound on that a little bit, because you're in touch with so many people who have been part of the civil rights and the labor movement now for the better part of a century. And you have a unique perspective to look at our moment and a younger generation and offer some words of counsel and advice that I think the rest of us should just listen to humbly. So expound on that quote a little bit and tell us, in the dark of the night, how do you see things in terms of the next generation following up on some of this work? Where are we at?
Well, I think for the current generation, we've seen such groups as Black Lives Matter emerge and engage in demonstrations, particularly in reaction and response to instances of police brutality and tragic deaths at the hands of police. But one of the things that is needed is linking
unknown caller
that involvement and the involvement of involvement in a broader sense, and recognize that the issue of police behavior is part of a larger group institution of a function of government.
Wow.
And that I think that the defining issues such as the fight for a decent livable wage, the fight for the fight to deal with and decrease the debt that students have mounted to get and maintain college. That it's these issues that we think need to be put into a political context and see how in fact and that today's youth need to be engaged in action that focuses and presses government and elected officials to respond.
Okay, good for that.
And it seems to me that that's the challenge and the mission that we face today as we reach out and involve young people.
Yeah, it would seem to me that a lot of our younger people and people my age too, and all ages, we tend to live in our own little bubbles, and so-called social media hasn't helped that. We
Yeah.
just talk to people like us. We don't reach out and form coalitions because we don't know anybody except people who are already in our little bubble.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I want to take a minute and just look through the book. There's some incredible pictures here. We're looking at climbing the rough side of the mountain, and Velma has told us the story that goes with that. This is a little bit informal, but here's a picture of Velma a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow. Yes. Ah, oh, boy.
And then here are some of the folks in your family, and
Yeah.
then some of the protest pictures here. Holding signs up,
Yeah.
doing things. There's a
Yeah.
good collection of pictures here. While I'm looking through these and showing them, talk a little bit about that time when Martin Luther King Jr. came in and sat down on the floor with his legs crossed, and you guys were sitting around drinking tea and talking about things. Tell us a little bit about your working with him, because obviously this is someone everybody's interested in. And you were talking about the fact that people were sort of seeing him as a celebrity and a leader, but when he was killed, how you were remembering him as a man and how much more he was than this symbol. And he's sort of now, you go and look at the statue in Washington of him and how he's almost lost in that because he's this symbol, but you remember him as a man. Let's go there for a minute. Here you are speaking a couple of years ago.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Time went by quick.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
And here you are. There's the famous balcony where
Oh,
Luther King was
yeah.
shot. And then you guys are right here in the picture. Norman, you're all there. And I just want to tell people, you're looking at not only wise human beings who have been leaders in the great fight of our time, but you are also looking at people who were there and saw things. So talk to us about Martin Luther King Jr. and how you saw him as a man and knew him. And, I loved one part of your book where you were saying, you worked with him, but you can't claim to have been friends in the sense that you had a working relationship. I believed every word you said after that, because, people like to amplify connections.
Yes. Oh,
They
God.
met somebody, but you actually had a working relationship with him.
Yeah.
And you knew him. Tell us about that.
Well, in 1964, in the presidential election year, in which Lyndon Johnson and Goldwater were the contending candidates, Martin Luther King conducted a six-city get out the vote tour in northern cities, urging people to get out and vote. And I helped organize the tour, but I remember especially where we had then kind of an informal discussion with Martin Luther King and his key assistant, Andrew Young. Bayard Rustin was a part of it. In the meeting, Velma and I were there.
And Don Slayman from the AFL-CIO.
And the discussion, the focus of the discussion was where King should go next and where the focus of his future campaign ought to be. And we discussed, I think it was King who raised that he felt that he ought to go north, and particularly ought to go to Chicago. And this was shortly after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65 that this discussion took place. And I remember Bayard Rustin trying to make the case for King campaigning in the South to make sure that now that the voters' discrimination was eliminated by the Voting Rights Act, which has now been weakened by Supreme Court decision, but then that he ought to be mobilizing in a massive way Black voters in the South to, in fact, engage politically and began to address the economic and social problems facing Blacks, and that he would face a much different situation in a northern city like Chicago, where Blacks have been voting for some time, or Blacks held political office in this city of Chicago, where Blacks were aldermen and Blacks were a part of what was then the Daley machine, Mayor Daley being the mayor of Chicago, and that you would find that Blacks reacted and responded politically as a part of that machine, and generating Black support for issues independent of that machine would not be an easy task. There were institutions in a city like Chicago in which discrimination was a part of the institution, and that didn't respond simply or directly to a march.
Yes, and he found that out, by the way.
And in the book, you talk about the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. and yourselves were sort of shocked by the level of the brutality and the racism that he confronted in the marches there in Chicago in the North.
I wasn't.
No, you weren't, because you knew about it.
Absolutely.
Going back to getting that rock in your
That's right.
face.
It was really a brick.
Brick.
Yeah. But he was convinced that he should go to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no stopping him. I think because the civil rights movement in Chicago really needed him, and they were exhibiting their will, But he was a very simple man who, by Rustin, taught about nonviolence. I think there was a movie called Boycott, where a character, Bayard Rustin, went to his home, and there were guns and everything, and he said, no, you're not gonna lead a movement with guns. And he taught him about nonviolence. And by the way, he also made up the bylaws of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Hmm.
And by the way, there is a film now on Bayard Rustin, and it's just beginning to let people know of his character and his important role in the civil rights movement. And I recommend it. It's not the complete history, and I think that there's going to have to be another movie about Bayard Rustin, but it is worth seeing.
Well, if you're in touch with some of the folks who are involved in the making of that, put them in touch with my producer Ernie, so we can interview them, and we'll make a point of trying to promote that.
Oh, that's very good.
So please let us know when we get off here. Ernie will stay on with you. Don't hang up, as it were, when we're finished. Talk to Ernie a little bit about who these people are, because we can get behind that a little bit.
Okay. But by the way, I think that the Obamas, the production company for the Obamas, was instrumental.
Well, you know the Obamas. There's nice pictures of you in the book meeting with President Obama. How did that go?
That went very well, but we didn't spend a lot of time with them, although he was very important as a figure, and I think as a man. His family was sort of untouched by the scandals and I think I think that we're doing a article. Actually, they're doing an article about us in the Times, and the author of the article has agreed to make it her business to get to the Obamas.
Good.
I think with our book and with our presence
there's a picture of you with President Obama, and also, of course, with President Clinton. I mean, basically, you've met everybody who mattered for the last 70 years.
That's true, but we should probably be a little more pushy than we are.
I think so, because you've got plenty to push about. You actually have met and know everybody. You've worked with everybody, and you haven't dropped any names at all. But I just want to go to something in the book that I want you to talk a little bit. I'm going to read from a section that you have toward the end on things that you think need to be done. A major part of our efforts is being directed at the unfinished business of the demands of the 1963 march. And these are things that are unfinished from 1963 to now. Talk about coalitions and what young people can be doing. Here are your priorities. And it's not all about me, or, one little group. You think big. Here are your priorities. A national federal jobs program aimed at training and employing all willing and able to work.
Yes.
An American trade policy that no longer places manufacturing workers at a competitive disadvantage in the global economy. A living wage for workers.
Yes.
A quality education for all. Universal quality health care. America's prison industrial complex. Protection of our natural environment. I loved what you concentrate on is not yourselves, and it's not any kind of sense of self-vindication in this book. You go to here you are at the end of such a long arc of activism, and you're listing the unfinished things that need to continue to be worked on. And what amazed me in reading that is none of it's trivial. It's all the real stuff. Yeah. It's not getting bogged down in little stuff. Yeah. You think in terms of big things. And I just love that about your book. It's so inspiring. By the way, just once again, here's the cover. It's in your bookstore. Climbing the Rough Side of the Mountain, The Extraordinary Story of Love, Civil Rights, and Labor Activism by Norman Hill and Velma Murphy Hill. I talk to a lot of people. I write myself. In this book, you will encounter people, if I can say this without offending anybody else I might interview, they know what they're talking about. They've been there, done that. This is the real deal. So I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's a slice of history. It's a love story. It's passionate. It's self-effacing. It's honest, and it's low-key. Meeting you through the book has been a great privilege and an honor. And so let's go back to that list I read there and kind of finish up with that a little bit. In the folks you talk to these days, are people working on these things in coalition or not?
There is not enough coalition. I think Reverend Barbara, I'm not even sure where Black Lives Matters, whether they are coalitionists, but I think they are, at least on the surface, coalitionist.
You mentioned Reverend Barber
Yes.
in the book as someone who's doing something positive.
Yes.
And you sort of hold him up as an example of someone who is, I guess, a coalitionist, would you say?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. But I think that we should be bringing people from the civil rights movement, the labor movement, from the religious community. We should be bringing them together over priorities for 2024 and 2025. We should be bringing them together, and we are not. And we were thinking about developing a clearinghouse for discussions about bringing people together. And maybe we will, and I know that there should be. There should be the beginning of the real coalition for change.
Yeah, we're thinking of bringing together the emerging youth with the veteran leaders of the movement.
Yeah.
So that there can be the emerging youth, and with their focus and immediate and concerns to get together with the experience of veteran activists of the movement, and so that there can be a meshing of, and in fact, youth can positively profit from the lessons and experiences of veteran activists.
And veteran activists can listen with not with a deaf ear, not with an attitude of we're going to teach you, but that we're going to learn together how to forge a society that is for everyone.
Well, anything that we can do with our little podcast and outreach that we've got to help host that conversation, or just keep us informed. Anybody you think we ought to be interviewing, Velma, if you think of someone, whether it's who's made a movie or written a book, or another activist, if they need to be heard from, please let us know. Send us, you can send us one name or 100, and we'll interview them all. And any coalition you want to do, and you need any help hosting that or whatever, just let us know what we can do.
Well, I really do. We appreciate that, because it could be the beginning of change in society, and it's really needed, by the way. It's really needed. And we thank you for having us. We're also going to speak to Jennifer.
Yes.
I think she facilitated this.
She did indeed. I'm going to send her a big thank you. She's a lovely lady and has done a lot for me over the years in terms of all the books I've published. But this is one of the best things she's done for me, is introducing you to us, because this has just been such a privilege to talk to you both.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, well, hey, it's all the other way. I thank you. And thank you for being there. Thanks for everything you've been through, climbing the rough side of the mountain for the rest of us, and then bringing us the story. It's a wonderful book. And I'm so touched that you would take the time to talk to me. Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thank you.